So the first exercises you're going to do are color drawdowns or color gradients, and you'll make a color wheel. So for the initial exercises, the colors that you're using are a lemon yellow, a yellow ochre, a cadmium scarlet, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, Prussian blue, and burnt umber. So right now I'm starting with the lemon yellow. It does make sense to start with the lighter colors in your palette first so your water stays clear longer. And I'm mixing up a saturated hue. So with watercolors, you always add water, and the consistency of your paint should be quite liquidy, like almost as thin as water. And you're looking to add enough pigment to the water such that you have a vibrant hue, and then you use water to dilute the color into a tint. So I'm drawing it down, like I'll start with the saturated hue on the left and then pull it out toward the right and just add a little bit of water as I go. So now I'm starting with the yellow ochre. I'm getting the paint to the right consistency in the cup there, laying it in on the left. And then adding a little water to my brush, which will effectively dilute the color. I got a little too much, so I blotted it on my cloth, and I'm going right back into that wet yellow ochre and pulling it to the right, and then diluting my brush a little bit more, pulling it to the right. I'll dilute it again until I have kind of the least saturated color that I can get without really getting toward white. Although the lighter part of the color doesn't show so much on the video here. Now I've sped up the video so you can see me laying in the different colors that I just listed a little bit more quickly. You could also do a value scale in boxes, but I think that's it's more work essentially, and I think you get the idea of the spectrum of color that you can get simply by diluting your pigments. And these give you a sense of what the colors are straight out of the tube. As the colors get a little bit darker, it'll take me a little bit longer to draw them out. If your watercolor feels at all pasty in your brush, then that's way too thick and you need to thin it with water. So watercolors are essentially pigment suspended in gum arabic or some binder, and that binder is water soluble, so as you pull it out with your brush and with water, it will spread. If it's thick at all, close to acrylic or like resembling acrylic, then that is not the right consistency for watercolor. The ultramarine, which is the color I just laid down, that in watercolor tends to separate the most. My impression is that's because the particles themselves are a little bit heavier, so they kind of settle out in the watercolor, especially if you have an excessive amount of water. Watercolor doesn't respond super well to overworking or to going back into it, but if you have a wet area and you kind of need to go back in and smooth something out, you can do that. You often want to have a light touch with your brush. Make sure you're using a watercolor brush as well. Any like an oil brush would be too stiff and the bristles will be too coarse. And if your brush doesn't come to a nice point, you'll probably have a hard time getting control or sharp edges as well. Okay, so I've got that top set of colors. Those are the ones you'll be using for all these exercises. But we also have Viridian Green that I'm drawing down here. And we have an Opera Rose, which is kind of a hot pink. And I got those just for a little bit of fun extra color. Now that I've done these drawdowns, I'm labeling each of the colors, which I recommend you do for your own reference. Again, it's lemon yellow, yellow ochre, cadmium scarlet, alizarin crimson, which is essentially magenta, ultramarine, Prussian blue, and burnt umber. I've left a gap to create a black, which is one of your exercises that I'll demonstrate in a moment. And then we have the Viridian Green and that Opera Rose again. So in watercolor, it's typical to not use white because the paper is white and you simply dilute a color to make it lighter, and also to not use black. So it's good to be able to create what you consider to be a black using the colors in your palette. The easiest way to make a black is by using your darkest blue and your darkest brown, mixing those together. And sometimes that alone will make a black, but often that will make a color that's a little bit greenish black. And so to neutralize the green, you can put in some red, particularly the alizarin crimson. And because red and green are complementary colors, they will become more neutral. And you want to make sure you have a nice saturated version of the color, so you're adding enough pigment to your water, and that should make a nice black for you. If it goes a little bit too blue, then you can add a little bit of brown. If it's a little too brown, you can add a little bit more blue. If it goes a little green, then you would add a little bit more of that alizarin crimson to balance it out. When you draw down that black, and you'll do this for your own exercise, it will turn gray, and the gray should reveal to you that you've made a pretty neutral black. I didn't get the black quite as saturated as I'd like, so while it's still wet, I'm going back in from the top and spreading it down through the damp drawdown. It's already a bit diluted, and so it's spreading out nicely as I work toward the right. Now I'm going to show you how to make a color wheel. I used my tape to just give me a circle to work with. And the colors you'll use for your color wheel are the lemon yellow, the alizarin crimson, and the ultramarine blue. Those are the three colors that are the brightest and that will mix the best. The cadmium red has a little bit of yellow in it, and therefore when you mix it with other colors it turns a little bit muddy, and so these are kind of the richest colors of our red, yellow, and blue primaries that you can work with for your color wheel. So those three primary colors I'm laying in first, just straight out of the tube, and then I will take those colors and mix them together to make my secondary colors. my secondary colors are orange, purple, and green. You're probably familiar with these already. And once you've made those secondary colors, you can keep using those to mix your tertiary colors. To make a tertiary color, you'll mix your secondary color with the adjacent primary color. So for example, you can make yellow-orange by mixing your orange with your yellow. And just a reminder that when you say a tertiary color, you always say the primary color followed by the secondary color, so yellow-orange. You'll notice that the primary colors separate the color wheel into thirds, or if you were to draw points connecting them inside the color wheel, it would form a triangle. So those three colors create a triadic color scheme, and any other colors or sets of colors that are separated by a triangle or kind of separate the color wheel into thirds are also a triadic color scheme. So I'm labeling my primary, secondary, and tertiary colors on the color wheel as I go. I don't mind if your little circles that you paint are oblong or different shapes. This purple that I'm laying in is kind of a funny shape. As long as you can see the color, that's great. I do recommend making your colors at least an inch or so in diameter, just so you can get a good sense of them. If you make them too small, then it's hard to get an impression of the color. Here I'm using a thirsty brush to pick up a little bit of pigment in some of the circles that have a little bit too much. And then I'm dabbing the brush on my cloth to pick up some of that moisture. And then I can go back in and pull a little bit more pigment out if I'd like. You don't want to end up with your paints drying shiny. If that's the case, again, then you've been working with paint that's too thick or too saturated. You should be able to see the paper through your color still. When you finish painting your wheel, make sure you label all of your colors, and also make sure you label whether the color is primary, secondary, or tertiary, so that I know that you know how that works. Okay, so those are the first two exercises in the set we will be doing. The next thing we're going to work on is creating 2 color charts. So you can move on to the next video when you're ready.